Welcome back to the Deep Dive on the Knowledge Channel. I'm your host, and today, well, we're going to tackle some really persistent misunderstandings about Islam.
It's a really important conversation to have.
Absolutely. And to help us navigate this, we have our expert guide with us. Thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
Let's dive right in. What would you say are some of the most common, maybe the most significant misconceptions you encounter regarding, the core beliefs or practices of Islam?
Yeah, thank you. There are definitely several key areas where misunderstandings seem to crop up quite often. But one of the most significant and I think quite damaging, especially today, revolves around the term jihad.
Ah, jihad. Yes, that word immediately brings certain images to mind for many people, often, unfortunately, images of violence. Okay, let's unpack this. Based on our sources, like Dar al-Ifta, what does jihad truly mean in the Islamic tradition?
Well, the Dar al-Ifta source is very clear that jihad is a concept with, a really rich and quite varied set of meanings. It goes far beyond just armed conflict. In fact, there's a profound understanding of what's called the greater jihad.
The greater jihad.
Yes. The Prophet Muhammad himself, apparently upon returning from a battle, actually emphasized this. He said something like, we have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad, the jihad of the soul.
Jihad of the soul. So that sounds like an internal struggle.
Exactly. It refers to that constant internal struggle against one's own base desires, negative inclinations. It's really a lifelong pursuit of self-improvement, spiritually and ethically.
So at its core, it's about personal growth, that internal battle. That's a really significant departure from the common portrayal, isn't it?
It really is.
What other dimensions does jihad cover then?
Well, jihad can also show up in other really important ways. For example, the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, that's considered a form of jihad.
The Hajj. Interesting.
Especially the sources mention, for women and the elderly, those who might not typically be involved in, say, military defense. Aisha, the Prophet's wife, is quoted as saying their jihad was the pilgrimage. So that highlights how jihad can mean any kind of challenging effort made in the way of God.
Yeah.
And another aspect is speaking truth to power.
Holding leaders accountable.
Yes. Holding those in authority accountable, government oversight, that's also seen as a form of jihad. A really crucial part of responsible governance in an Islamic context. So you see, it's less about constant warfare and more about continuous struggle, both inside ourselves and only when absolutely necessary and under strict rules in defense of justice.
That's fascinating. Pilgrimage, speaking truth. So where does the armed struggle idea fit in, the one we hear about most often?
Right. That falls under what's known as the lesser jihad. And it does relate to the defense of a nation or, a just cause.
Okay, defense.
And this is absolutely critical. This type of jihad is governed by very specific, very strict conditions. It must be in the way of God, which means it's limited to self-defense against actual aggression or to alleviate tyranny or prevent oppression.
So specific justifications.
Exactly. It fundamentally distinguishes it from, indiscriminate violence or killing. Those are considered serious crimes in Islam. You can maybe think of it like the internationally accepted idea of national self-defense, a last resort, with clear rules.
Right. So the sort of brutal warfare sometimes linked to the word jihad is actually a distortion. It's fundamentally opposed to how Muslims generally understand it.
Precisely. It's a very serious misrepresentation to just equate jihad with aggressive, indiscriminate violence. That's not the core meaning at all.
Okay. Let's shift gears then to another really entrenched misconception, this idea that Islam oppresses women or views women as somehow inferior to men. That narrative is incredibly persistent. What do our sources, Dar al-Ifta and ALC, tell us about this?
Yeah, that's a big one. And both sources strongly challenge that view. The ALCO document, for instance, emphasizes that Islam actually establishes a woman's equality with man in terms of inherent dignity and religious standing based on her faith and piety.
Equality and dignity and faith.
Correct. And Dar al-Ifta backs this up, highlighting that the Quran itself affirms equal rights and responsibilities for both men and women before God. Islam, actually, compared to pre-Islamic Arabia, brought pretty significant advancements for women.
But what about that specific Quranic verse, the one that says, and men are a degree above them? People often point to that as proof of male superiority.
Right, that verse is often taken out of context. Dar al-Ifta provides really crucial clarification here. It explains that this specific degree refers directly to the responsibility of financial maintenance. It's called nafaka.
Nafaka, financial support.
Yes. It's the obligation placed on men to financially support and care for their wives and families. It's framed as a responsibility, a duty, not as a marker of superior status or greater honor. In fact, it's a right. Women can demand the right to be financially supported.
Ah, okay. So it's about who holds the primary financial responsibility within the family, not about inherent worth.
Exactly. Different roles, different responsibilities within the family structure, not fundamental inequality.
Yeah. What else do the sources say about the status of women?
Well, they really emphasize the high honor and status given to women, especially in their roles as mothers and as the primary educators of children. There's a very famous saying of the Prophet, which Dar al-Ista mentions, stressing the immense importance of the mother.
Like, paradise lies at the feet of mothers. That one.
That's a related sentiment, yes, emphasizing that respect. And they also cite another saying, men and women are brother and sister, highlighting this principle of shared fundamental rights. Dar al-Ista points out the Quran itself doesn't claim God has preferred men over women in inherent worth. There's a verse, something like, do not covet the bounties which God has bestowed more abundantly on some of you than on others.
Okay.
Which suggests, differing God-given roles and strengths, not that one gender is inherently better than the other.
That's interesting. And the sources also touch on the story of the Garden of Eden, the expulsion. How does Islam view women's role in that? Because in some traditions, women get the blame.
Right. And Dar al-Ista directly refutes that. They cite a verse from the Quran, 2.36, which says, Satan caused them both to stumble therein, both Adam and Eve. It clearly rejects the idea that the woman was the sole or primary cause of sin.
Both were responsible.
Yes. And they also highlight another verse, Quran 4.34, describing the righteous women as truly devout ones who guard the intimacy which God has ordained to be guarded. This portrays women as equally responsible, morally accountable individuals.
So if it's not rooted in the core Islamic texts, where did this idea of female inferiority or subordination come from?
Well, Dar al-Ista suggests that gender discrimination was unfortunately a pretty common societal norm before Islam, and those pre-Islamic cultural attitudes inevitably influenced some later interpretations and practices over time. But, they argue, it's not part of the pure, unadulterated teachings of Islam itself. In many ways, early Islam was quite revolutionary in elevating women's status.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's move to another common misconception. The idea that Islam forces people to convert, that there's no real freedom of religion. What do our sources say about this?
On this point, Dar al-Ista is really quite unequivocal. They point to several key verses right from the Quran that firmly establish the principle of religious freedom.
Like what?
Well, there are very clear declarations such as, unto you your religion, and unto me my religion, and also, whosoever will, let him believe, and whosoever will, let him disbelieve. Perhaps the most famous is, there is no compulsion in religion. The right direction is distinct from error.
No compulsion in religion. That seems very direct.
It is. These verses are foundational to the Islamic understanding of religious tolerance and freedom of conscience.
So given those clear statements, why does the idea of forced conversion or lack of religious freedom persist?
That's a fair question. While Islam obviously encourages its followers to remain in the faith and considers abandoning it, apostasy, a serious sin in God's eyes, punishable in the afterlife. Dar al-Ista emphasizes there's generally no prescribed worldly punishment simply for choosing to leave the faith.
No worldly punishment just for changing beliefs.
Correct. It's generally considered a matter between the individual and God concerning the hereafter.
But we do hear about cases where apostasy is punished in some places. How does that fit with no compulsion?
Right. The source clarifies this distinction. Worldly intervention, like legal action, is said to come into play only when the act of leaving Islam is combined with actions that actively undermine the stability and security of the society itself.
Like what kind of actions?
Things like sedition, inciting violence against the community, or actively working to treasonously dismantle the social order. In those specific, extreme cases, it becomes a matter for the legal system, seen as necessary to protect the well-being and integrity of the whole society. It's framed not purely as a punishment for disbelief in this life, but as a response to actions threatening the community.
Okay, so it's the actions linked to leaving the faith, if they harm society, that trigger a response, not the change of belief itself.
That's the distinction the source makes, yes. The underlying principle mentioned is that sometimes the preservation of the society's safety and cohesion might take precedence over certain individual freedoms, but only when those freedoms are being used to directly threaten the community's existence or fundamental structures.
So the focus is safeguarding the community from tangible harm, rather than policing personal faith in this life.
Exactly. Religious belief itself is considered personal. Societal intervention, according to this view, is reserved for situations posing a clear danger to public order and well-being.
All right, let's tackle perhaps one of the most controversial areas, Islamic law or Sharia. It's often perceived, especially certain punishments, as barbaric or inhumane. The punishment for theft amputation is the classic example people raise. The ALCO source gives a specific perspective on this, right?
Yes, it does. The ALCO document presents a viewpoint on this.
Yeah.
It starts by asserting that human rights in Islam are seen as divinely ordained, not things granted by rulers or lawmakers that can be changed. They're considered integral, immutable parts of the faith.
Okay, divinely ordained rights.
And when it addresses the punishment for theft, the cutting off of the hand source presents this as a rule explicitly ordained by God in the Quran. They cite the verse directly.
And what's the reasoning offered within that source to justify what seems like, well, a very severe punishment to many outsiders?
The ALCO source highlights the belief that this specific ruling has been basically a matter of unanimous agreement among Muslims since the beginning of Islam. The core argument presented is that this punishment acts as a very powerful deterrent.
A deterrent against theft.
Yes, against theft and similar property crimes. The argument is that it leads to much greater safety and security in societies that implement it. They even use Saudi Arabia as an example, suggesting from this perspective that shopkeepers there can leave shops open without fear. So from this viewpoint, the severity is seen as a preventative measure that ultimately protects the entire community's right to security and property, which are considered essential aspects of justice in their framework.
That's certainly a different lens than how it's typically viewed externally. Does the source address the criticism directly, the idea that it's cruel or inhumane?
It does. The AALCO document emphasizes the perspective that within the framework of Islamic Sharia, this punishment is not considered cruelty. They state that Sharia itself is believed to be rooted in compassion and justice, and that the Prophet Muhammad was sent as a mercy to mankind. They even quote a saying, something like, "Mercy will not be shown to one who does not have mercy on others." So the argument presented is that this punishment, while undeniably severe from one angle, is seen as ultimately preventing wider harm and crime, thereby protecting the community's well-being and property rights in a more significant way. It's framed as a form of societal mercy, in a sense.
Now, it's really important we emphasize here for you listening that we're presenting the viewpoint articulated in that ALCO source. We aren't endorsing it, nor are we taking a side on whether it's barbaric or not. Our goal is simply to convey the reasoning and the perspective as it's laid out in the source material itself.
Absolutely. That's crucial. It's about understanding the justification provided within that specific context and source.
Well, this has been incredibly illuminating. We've managed to dig into some really pervasive, sometimes damaging misconceptions about Islam, drawing directly from these sources. We've looked at the real meaning of jihad.
Much broader than often thought.
Right. And the affirmation of fundamental equality for women in Islamic teachings, the core principle of religious freedom.
The no compulsion principle.
Exactly. And the reasoning behind certain aspects of Islamic law that are so often misunderstood or viewed through a very narrow lens, it really shows how vital it is to look beyond just headlines or stereotypes and engage with the actual sources and different perspectives.
Indeed. That's the whole point of these deep dives, isn't
Right.
it? To try and provide a more nuanced, more informed understanding based on the material we have, and hopefully encourage more thoughtful engagement with these really complex and important topics.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you, our listener, with something to think about. Consider the challenges involved in interpreting any religious text or practice, especially across different cultures and different points in history. How might our own backgrounds, our own assumptions, and maybe the way information is framed in the media we consume, how might all that contribute to or maybe even challenge the very misconceptions we've talked about today?
That's a great point.
Perhaps making that conscious effort to seek out diverse sources, to hear different perspectives directly, is a really vital step towards building a more informed, more nuanced understanding of the world and the people in it. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.